There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when power walks in without announcing itself. Not the silence of absence, the silence of recognition, of held breath, of people suddenly remembering their posture. She didn't know that kind of silence. Not yet. Amara Ose had spent the last 4 years learning to make herself smaller in rooms that weren't built for her. Smaller in meetings, smaller at networking dinners where the wine cost more than her first week's salary, smaller in elevators where no one moved to make space. She had learned, the way black women in European corporate environments often learn, that competence alone was never enough, that she would have to be brilliant and invisible at the same time, and that these two demands would eventually break something inside her. They had already started. She was 34 years old, a senior pastry chef with a Michelin-recognized portfolio and a reputation that had traveled from Accra to Paris to Milan, and she was sitting in the arrivals lounge of Malpensa Airport on a Tuesday morning in November, eating a croissant that tasted like cardboard, waiting for a taxi she couldn't entirely afford, wondering if accepting this consulting contract had been the worst decision of her professional life. The call had come through her agent 3 weeks earlier, a private culinary consultancy contract, Northern Italy. 6 weeks. Confidential client. The fee was enough to clear the debt that had been sitting on her chest for 2 years. She had said yes before she finished reading the details. Now she was here, her 2 large suitcases standing beside her like faithful guards, her wool coat damp from the rain outside, her braids pulled back into a bun that had survived a 4-hour flight and was now losing the argument with humidity, and she was so tired that the idea of finding the right exit felt like climbing a mountain. The lounge was crowded. Business travelers, families, a school group moving through in a chaotic ribbon. Amara looked around for an empty seat and found almost nothing, just a long bench near the windows where most of the seats were occupied, and one open spot at the far end. Next to a man. She almost didn't approach. She had learned in 4 years of European airports and European waiting rooms to read the energy of a space before entering it, and something about the far end of that bench felt charged, dense. The people seated nearest to it seemed to be giving it a wide perimeter without quite acknowledging why, but her feet hurt, her back hurt, and she had 40 minutes before her taxi confirmation would come through. She walked over, stopped beside the empty seat, looked at the man sitting next to it. He was perhaps 50, perhaps less. It was difficult to tell because his face had the quality of something that had been sculpted under pressure and emerged harder and more defined for it. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a suit that cost more than some cars, worn with the ease of someone who had never had to think about the cost of anything. His hands were resting on his knees, large and still. He was not looking at his phone. He was not reading. He was simply sitting, looking forward, the way people who are very accustomed to being watched learn to look at nothing. Amara hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then, because she was exhausted and her feet hurt, and she was done performing smallness for rooms that didn't deserve it, she bent slightly and said, just loud enough to be heard over the lounge noise, "Can I sit here?" The man turned his head. His eyes were grey, not the soft grey of winter skies, the sharp grey of uncut stone. They moved to her face with a precision that felt less like a glance and more like an assessment, fast, complete, as if in 2 seconds he had catalogued everything, the damp coat, the tired braids, the croissant wrapper in her left hand, the specific quality of exhaustion that comes not from a long flight, but from a long time. He said nothing for a moment. Then he moved his coat from the seat beside him without a word and looked forward again. Amara sat. She exhaled slowly. She unwrapped the second half of her croissant and took a bite, staring at the departures board across the hall, and for a few minutes there was nothing between them except airport noise and the particular companionable silence of 2 strangers sharing space. Then she made a sound, a small involuntary sound of culinary offense. "This is terrible," she said. Not to him, to the croissant, to the universe. A pause. "The lamination is wrong," the man beside her said. His English was precise, accented, Italian underneath every syllable. "You can see it from the layers. The butter wasn't cold enough when they folded it." Amara turned to look at him. He was still looking forward, but there was something fractionally different about the set of his jaw, something that might, in a different man, have been called almost a smile. "You know pastry," she said. "My grandmother did," he said. "She would have thrown that in the bin." Amara looked down at the croissant. Then she looked up at him. "She sounds like a woman of standards." "She was a woman of many things," he said, and this time the something at the corner of his mouth was unmistakable, brief and controlled, a crack in stone, letting through a single thread of light. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that every person in a 50-meter radius had recognized him the moment he sat down, and had decided collectively that the safest response was to find somewhere else to be. She didn't know that the man sitting beside her, discussing the structural failure of airport croissants, with the flat calm of someone who had once restructured an entire regional economy and made 3 men disappear from the public record in the same calendar year, was Luca Ferri. She didn't know that Luca Ferri was not a name people in northern Italy said out loud, without first checking who was listening. She didn't know any of that. If you've ever found yourself in a room where something important was about to happen, and you were the only one who didn't know it, stay with us. Because what happened next is the part that changes everything. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because the stories we tell on this channel are exactly this. The moments where ordinary encounters become the pivot point of an entire life. She told him she was a pastry chef. She said it the way people say things they are proud of, but have learned to offer carefully, waiting to see if the recipient will treat it like a gift or a triviality. He received it with neither. He asked which training. She said Paris first, then private study in Japan, then 4 years of independent work across 3 countries. He said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, the almost imperceptible shift of someone recalibrating their assumptions. She asked what he did. He said he managed interests. She didn't push. She had spent enough time in rooms with powerful men to know that "manages interests" in a suit like that was a sentence designed to close a door, not open one. They sat in silence again, a comfortable silence which was strange because it shouldn't have been comfortable. She was tired and aching and stressed, and he was whatever he was. But it was. It had the specific quality of silence between people who have decided, without discussing it, to simply exist in the same space without performing. Her phone buzzed. Taxi confirmation. She looked at it, then looked at the exit signs, then looked at the rain hammering the glass doors, and felt a small wave of dread about dragging 2 large suitcases through all of that. She stood, picked up her coat, turned to him. "Thank you for the seat," she said. He looked up at her, the grey eyes again. That assessment. "Which hotel?" he said. She blinked. "Sorry?" "Which hotel are you consulting for?" She hadn't told him she was consulting. She had said she was a pastry chef. She watched him and he watched her, and neither of them pretended he hadn't just shown her something he hadn't intended to show, that he had listened more carefully than a stranger sitting in an airport should have. "Residenza Castellana," she said, "near Lago Maggiore." A pause. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. "Cancel the taxi," he said. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "I'm going within 3 kilometers of Castellana. My driver is outside." He stood. He was taller than she'd understood while seated, not dramatically, but with the density of height that comes with genuine physical authority. "Cancel the taxi. It will take 40 minutes in this rain. My car will take 20. "I don't know you," Amara said. "No," he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. The rain hit the glass. "I'm Amara," she said. "Luca," he said. She cancelled the taxi. The car was black and large and moved through the rain with the silence of something engineered for discretion. A driver in front, Luca beside her in the back, her suitcases in the boot. She sat close to the window on her side, watching the November landscape of Lombardy appear and disappear through the water on the glass. Fields, farmhouses, the silhouette of mountains behind low cloud, and tried to understand what exactly she had agreed to. He asked her about the consulting contract, not in a probing way, in the way of someone making conversation who is also, she suspected, always gathering information without entirely meaning to. She told him about the brief. The Residenza Castellana was expanding its dining program, adding a high-end dessert experience to its already established restaurant. They needed someone to design the menu, train the kitchen team, and consult on the pastry philosophy. 6 weeks. It was the kind of contract that, if it went well, would anchor her next 3 years. "If it goes well," he repeated, catching her phrasing. "The executive chef is territorial," she said. "I was warned before I arrived. He doesn't want a consultant. He wanted internal promotion. He's going to make the 6 weeks difficult." Luca was quiet for a moment. "Matteo Sanna," he said. She turned to look at him. "You know him?" "I know Castellana," he said simply. Then, as if the subject had concluded, "He is difficult because he is afraid. Men who are afraid are either dangerous or useful, depending on how they're handled." She thought about that for a moment. Which is he? Luca looked at her directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car, the grey eyes, unhurried. "That," he said, "will depend on you." She arrived at Residenza Castellana in the back of a car that she would later discover no one at the hotel had ever seen parked outside, not without advance notice, not without a particular kind of attention from the staff. And she walked into the lobby, leaving 2 wet footprints on marble, and the faint memory of a conversation she couldn't stop turning over. The first week confirmed everything she'd been warned about. Matteo Sanna was a large man with a large reputation and a small, specific hatred for her presence. He was not theatrical about it. He was surgical. He scheduled her team briefings at times that conflicted with other kitchen sessions, then noted her absences. He gave her access to a prep area with faulty refrigeration without mentioning the fault. He arranged a tasting with the general manager for a day when she hadn't had access to proper ingredients, then expressed concern in front of others about whether the consultant's standards were suited to our kitchen. Amara had dealt with Matteo Sannas before. Different names, different kitchens, different cities, same essential architecture, men who confused their fear of replacement with evidence of her inadequacy. She did not fight him directly. She worked around him with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the real audience was never the man in front of her. It was always the room watching both of them. She fixed the refrigeration herself, calling in a repair technician at her own expense and logging it with the hotel management. She arrived for every session 30 minutes early and stayed 90 minutes after. She produced, in the second week, a tasting menu for the dessert program that the general manager described in a private email she was accidentally copied on as frankly extraordinary. But none of that is why she was still thinking about Luca Ferri. She was thinking about him because on the 4th day after her arrival, a delivery came to the hotel kitchen with her name on it. A small wooden crate, inside which were 12 varieties of Italian butter sourced from specific alpine farms, with a handwritten note that said only, "For the lamination." No name, no return address. She stood in the kitchen holding that note for a long time. She thought about how a man who had sat beside her for 20 minutes in an airport and driven her 40 kilometers through the rain had apparently remembered a throwaway comment about croissants with enough precision and care to source specific butter and send it to a hotel she hadn't even told him she was staying at. And then she thought about what it meant that he knew anyway. Luca Ferri was aware of her. That was the only conclusion. Not in the passive way of someone who had noticed her, in the active way of someone who had decided to pay attention. That should have frightened her more than it did. It probably would have, if she'd known his name in any context other than the seat beside her at Malpensa. She found out the context at the end of week 2, when the general manager of Residenza Castellana called her into his office with the specific energy of a man who has just discovered something that changes the nature of a conversation he thought he was in control of. He asked her carefully how she knew Luca Ferri. She told him, airport, bench, shared ride, 20 minutes of conversation. He stared at her. Then he asked her to please consider, going forward, whether the terms of her consulting contract were suitable and whether there was anything the hotel could do to better support her work, and whether Matteo Sanna had been in any way obstructive, because they wanted to ensure, he said this twice, that her experience here was exceptional in every sense. She walked out of that office, and took the stairs to the roof terrace where it was cold and the lake was silver and enormous below her, and she stood there until she had organized her thoughts into something she could work with. Then she took out her phone and, using the number that had appeared on her screen the morning after she arrived, no text, just a number which she had saved with a question mark, she wrote, "I think I owe you an explanation about why I cancelled that taxi." 3 minutes later, "You owe me nothing." She wrote back, "I didn't know who you were." His response took longer this time, long enough that she was about to put the phone back in her pocket. Then, "I know." It was the first honest conversation I've had in a room with more than 2 people in it in 4 years. She read that twice. Then she looked out at the lake for a while. Then she wrote, "The butter was extraordinary, by the way. Your grandmother would have approved." They pause. Then, "She would have wanted to meet you. Like and subscribe if you've ever told the truth to a stranger, precisely because they didn't know who you were. Because what comes next is where this story becomes something neither of them expected." He came to Castellana 3 days later. Not quietly, though Luca Ferri was a man who could move quietly when he chose. He came with purpose in the late afternoon, arriving at the restaurant during a dinner service and requesting a table. The maître d' nearly had a heart attack. Matteo Sanna, who was informed by a sous-chef with a trembling voice that there was a particular person at table 7, went to look through the service window and then returned to the kitchen, and was very, very calm for the rest of the night in the particular way of a man who has just fundamentally reassessed a situation. Amara knew none of this until the general manager appeared at the door of the pastry kitchen at 9:30 and told her, in a strained voice, that there was a guest who had specifically requested to compliment the pastry chef in person. She came out of the kitchen with flour on her sleeve and a smudge of dark chocolate on her left wrist, her braids pinned back, wearing her chef's whites, and she walked into the dining room and found Luca Ferri sitting at a corner table with a plate that held 3 of her desserts and an expression that held for once nothing concealed. "You came," she said. "I was in the area," he said. She sat down across from him without being invited, because she had flour on her sleeve and chocolate on her wrist and no patience left for the performance of formality. He watched her do it with something in his eyes that was warm in a way she hadn't seen in that face before, warm and slightly undone, which on a face like his was considerable. "Tell me which one you preferred," she said, nodding at the plate. He pointed without hesitation to the smallest of the 3, a thin disc of olive oil cake with poached pear and a liqueur cream that she had spent 2 weeks refining. "Why?" she said. "Because it tastes like somewhere specific," he said. "Like a memory that isn't yours yet." She stared at him. In 12 years of professional cooking, across 3 countries and 2 languages, no one had ever described her food that way. She had received technical praise, enthusiastic praise, economic praise. She had never received that. "That's the most accurate description anyone has ever given me," she said. "I told you," he said. "My grandmother knew pastry." They stayed at that table for an hour after the dining room emptied. The staff moved around them carefully, refilling water, removing plates, turning down lights at a respectful distance, performing the specific choreography of people in the presence of someone they are very careful not to disturb. He told her things. Not everything. She understood that Luca Ferri would never tell anyone everything, but things. He told her that he had not eaten a meal in a restaurant without security clearance on the space in 11 years. He told her that the conversation at Malpensa had been the first time in a long time that he'd said something, because he meant it, rather than because it was useful. He told her that he had sent the butter because he had wanted to, and that wanting to do something simply because it would please someone else was an experience he had almost forgotten was available to him. She listened. She did not fill his silences. She understood, from years of being the only person in rooms who could hear what wasn't being said, that he was not accustomed to being listened to without agenda. "Your work is being undermined," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "You don't need my intervention," he said, and this was careful. She heard the care in it. "But if you want me to ensure Matteo Sanna understands the precise nature of his position here, I can arrange that." She shook her head. "If you do that, Everything I've built in the last 2 weeks becomes his fear of you instead of respect for my work. I need the respect." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "you do." She understood in that moment that she was sitting across from a man who was more accustomed to solving problems with power than with restraint, and that what she had just watched him do was something that cost him something. The choosing not to. The putting down of the instrument he had used for so long he probably sometimes forgot it was an instrument. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said. And he did, for 20 minutes, with a different quality of voice than any she'd heard from him, softer, slower, with a regional Italian lilt that crept in when the words were real. He told her about a woman from a mountain village in Piedmont who had made pastry every Sunday morning for 53 years, who had once refused to serve the mayor of the town because he'd been rude to her neighbor, who had held her grandson's face in both hands when he was 12 years old and told him that power without gentleness was just noise. Amara listened. She felt something in her chest loosen, something that had been tight for a long time, a specific tightness she had grown so used to that she had stopped identifying it as pain. She would have thrown Matteo Sanna out of her kitchen, Amara said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, brief, genuine, slightly surprised at itself. On his first day, he agreed. The following 3 weeks were different, not because Luca Ferri made them different. She had meant what she said, and he had heard it. But because something in her had shifted that night at the table, some dial of self-permission turned quietly to a position it hadn't been in for years. She stopped making herself smaller, not loudly, not performatively. She simply stopped. She took up the space her talent required. She made decisions in the kitchen with the authority of someone who knew the difference between good and excellent, and was not willing to accept the former. She gave Matteo Sanna exactly the professional respect his role deserved, and not one atom more. And after the 3rd week he began with the grudging, reluctant inevitability of a man who can read the room when he has no other choice, to respond in kind. The tasting presentation for the hotel's ownership group happened on a Friday morning in week 5. Amara presented 12 desserts, spoke for 40 minutes about her design philosophy, answered questions without hedging, and watched the faces around the table change from polite interest to something she recognized as actual appetite, the appetite of people who have just encountered work that is better than they expected. The general manager called her that evening to offer an extension, a permanent consulting retainer, quarterly visits, a co-design credit on the menu. She said she would think about it. Then she put on her coat and walked to the terrace and called the number she had saved with a question mark, because she had replaced the question mark 4 weeks ago with a name. He answered on the 2nd ring. "They offered an extension," she said. "I heard," he said. Then, when she didn't respond immediately, "I have a connection to the ownership group. I didn't intervene, but I heard." "Of course you did," she said. She wasn't angry. She had long since stopped being surprised by the radius of his awareness. "What will you say?" he asked. She leaned on the terrace railing. The lake was dark and enormous, and still beneath the November sky. Somewhere across it, lights flickered in the villages on the far shore. "I don't know yet," she said. "What would you say?" A pause. In the silence she could hear him breathing, and the distant sound of what might have been rain on a window. "I would say," he said slowly, "that I would like you to stay closer to Milan." She closed her eyes. "That's not an answer about the contract," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She stood there for a long time after they hung up, feeling the cold and the dark and the largeness of the lake, and feeling also the specific quality of something beginning. Not the rushed, bright beginning of a thing you've fallen into, but the slow, deliberate beginning of a thing you've chosen. The kind that happens between people who have been through enough of the world to know the difference between need and recognition, and to choose recognition. Comment below if you've ever had a stranger see you more clearly than the people who were supposed to know you best. We'll be right here. On the last day of her contract, she delivered to the kitchen a bound document, the complete pastry philosophy she had developed for Castellana, with every recipe, every technique note, every sourcing recommendation, and a training manual for the team. It was 64 pages long. It was more than she had been contracted to produce. It was everything she knew how to give. Matteo Sanna found it on his workstation before service. He stood there for a moment, reading the first page, then the second. Then he walked to where she was packing her knives, and he said, without looking at her, his jaw tight with the effort of the thing, "This is exceptional work." She looked at him. "Thank you, Matteo," she said. He nodded once, walked away. She looked at the document and thought about how long it had taken, and how much it had cost, and whether it had been worth it. And she knew, with the clean certainty of someone who has stopped asking that question in the diminished way, that it had. She drove herself to the airport, not in a black car, in a rented Fiat that squeaked on the turns. She was early for her flight, and she found a seat in the arrivals lounge. The same lounge, she realized, though of course the bench had different people on it now. She sat down with a coffee and looked at the arrivals board and thought about the distance between the woman who had flown in 6 weeks ago and the woman sitting here now. The same tiredness in her body, but a different quality of it. A tiredness that was made of work rather than defeat. Her phone buzzed. A message. A single photograph. No text. The photograph was of a plate. On it, a croissant. Beside the plate, a small folded note that said, "I found a bakery. The lamination is correct." She looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about grey eyes and a grandmother from Piedmont, and a man who had spent 11 years unable to eat in a room without clearing it first, who had sat in an airport lounge because sometimes the only honest space available to a person is a crowd full of strangers, and who had turned his head when an exhausted woman with flour eventually in her future had asked the smallest question, "Can I sit here?" and heard in it, somehow, the question underneath. She wrote back, "Save me half." She boarded her flight. Below her, as the plane climbed through the November cloud, the lakes of Lombardy spread like scattered mirrors in a dark coat, holding light they'd borrowed from a sky that was already giving it back. She had 4 projects pending. A book proposal she hadn't opened in 2 months. A permanent position in Paris she had been circling without landing on. A grandmother's butter from Alpine Farms that had made the best croissants she would taste for a very long time, sent by a man who had no reason to remember the detail except that he had been paying attention. She chose the job in Milan, not because of him, or not only. She chose it because it was the right job at the right moment for the version of herself she had finally given herself permission to be, the version that didn't fold into smaller shapes to fit spaces she hadn't chosen, the version that asked for a seat and meant it as a statement. Some people walk into your life through grand doors, with introduction and fanfare and the full ceremony of arrival, and some people sit down next to you at an airport bench on a Tuesday morning in November while rain hammers the glass and say the technically accurate thing about croissants and change the orientation of your entire next chapter, so quietly that you don't realize, until you're 30,000 feet above the lakes, that the pivot already happened. The question was never who he was. It was always who she was in the moment she decided to sit down.